you are significantly warming up the planet just purely by pumping heat from these data centers out into the atmosphere. And at some point, then the only way, if you want more compute, that you can have it is by figuring out a way to dissipate that heat in a vacuum into the infinity of deep space. I actually like to think we're digging for gold, where the gold is the sunlight and we are harvesting that energy resource in space.
I think Sam Altman spoke a few days back that we inevitably have to move to space.
Or we do go build them in space. I don't know, it sounds cool to try to build them in space.
Because the current land data centers, the pollution, and the amount of heat generated becomes massive.
That is actually very small portion of the end state problem with building enormous amounts of data centers. Even if just using solar panels, for example, you are significantly warming up the planet just purely by pumping heat from these data centers out into the atmosphere. So imagine if you're a satellite that is taking enormous amounts of raw imagery. There's many use cases where you would want to get that data back very quickly. Most of those satellites, they'll pass over the target site where they take a photograph, and then they have to wait 60 or 90 minutes to get to a ground station before they can actually downlink any of that data. With what we're doing, so in space to space, you can use this optical mesh network that there is. We then process it on orbit, and then we just downlink the insight.
You see Elon Musk talking about the pursuit of AGI going forward, and you're playing a role in this whole process. What's your personal vision when it comes to AGI?
It's a good question.
All right, Philip, welcome to our podcast. I've been doing a bit of research on you, and I found that you initially was a pure mathematician, and you really loved that.
Yes.
Before you sort of switched to algorithmic trading, which you in one of your interviews called as sort of the job for boring losers. and sort of moved to McKinsey and then scaled the digital brands sort of marketplace in Dubai. As I understand, but during your days in algo trading, you figured that it helps to sort of learn the pattern recognition.
Yes.
So what kind of patterns you recognized at the moment when you decided that the future is in the space and the orbit computation?
I'll just clarify because I don't want to be, I don't want to lose friends in algo trading. So algo trading as a job, I find boring. I have lots of good friends that do algo trading who are not boring people. So in terms of pattern recognition, or at least what we're doing is the convergence of three main trends. The first main trend is there's very rapid increase in demand for tokens and for compute. The second is that is driving very rapid increase in demand for energy. And the third is that the launch cost is coming down very rapidly. And what we're doing is at the intersection of these three trends, essentially. And I'd say that if there was to be any pattern recognition in what we're doing, it's noticing that these three trends are converging and are heading in a certain direction.
And basically, Starcloud now raised the record, one of the record numbers in terms of the seed funding among the YC companies, and without even sending any satellite in space. So I'm curious, what was the sort of part of engineering of vision of the Starcloud versus engineering actual satellite in a way that helped you to raise that? How did you? What's the vision you sort of convince your investors in?
I think to invest in us, you need to believe a few things. Essentially, the three trends. If you buy into those three trends, we are a pretty obvious bet. If you don't, then we are a very risky sounding bet. So if you believe, for example, that Starship is going to lower the cost of launch by 10 or 100x, and if you also believe that that is going to drive the launch capacity up by maybe 10,000x, then you're probably looking for things that are going to happen in space that don't currently happen in space. Likewise, if you think that the growing demand for AI is not going to stop growing, it's not going to slow down anytime soon, which I do, then I think we are a pretty obvious bet. But the balance between believing that narrative and the actual engineering, I think, is a fine one, and people wouldn't invest in us if we hadn't proved to some degree that we are capable engineers. So all of the team is from SpaceX and NASA and Microsoft Azure on the data center side or on the hardware side. And we've also actually designed, built, and tested the first satellite. We're just waiting for the launch. So we're scheduled to launch between May and August. It's been pushed back to August. So now we're launching in August. Yeah.
Like you mentioned, the investors who believe that the cost of sending the ship things to the space basically will be decreased by 100x. That's a sort of a bet on Elon Musk sort of vision on Starship.
Yeah.
Do you have like a plan B if it doesn't happen, say, or happens in 5 years later, or it will not be like a target $50 per kilogram, but end up like $500?
Yeah. $500 is about the break even of where the longer term vision of or competing with terrestrial data centers breaks even. There's two mitigants to that. The first is that there are other launch vehicles coming online. The New Glenn vehicle from Blue Origin, the Neutron rocket from Rocket Lab, Stoke Space is trying to do some stuff. My view is they are quite far behind Starship. So if Starship doesn't work, it will be pretty delayed. But that's where the second mitigation comes in, which is if we are delayed, let's say 3 years or 5 years, the first business we're building is actually only reliant on the Falcon 9 launch prices. So we are launching the first service we're providing is an edge compute workload or like a cloud on orbit compute workload for other satellites, particularly for Earth observation and government satellites.
And that's where you want to also sort of propose the new way of solving this bottleneck with Downlink. Could you share a little bit more about?
Yeah. So imagine if you're a satellite that is taking enormous amounts of raw imagery. So for example, you might be, in the case of the government, you might be monitoring a battlefield. In the case of commercial, you might be monitoring shipping lanes. And you use that data to then forecast a whole bunch of things. There's many use cases where you would want to get that data back very quickly, particularly if it's a battlefield situation. What happens right now is satellites are flying, they're in low Earth orbit, which means they're orbiting once every 90 minutes. Most of those satellites are not connected to anything for most of their orbit. So they'll pass over the target site where they take a photograph, and then they have to wait half an hour or 60 or 90 minutes to get to a ground station before they can actually downlink any of that data. And when they are above ground station, they're getting very low data rates, usually a few hundred megabit a second data rates. With what we're doing, they will be able to, there's a constraint from space to Earth. There's less of a constraint from space to space. So in space to space, you can use this optical mesh network that there is produced by that Starlink is essentially produced. And so they'll be able to ship enormous amounts of raw imagery to us, either through the Starlink network or just directly. We then process it on orbit, and then we just downlink the insight. So the insight might be, for example, there is a ship in this location moving in this direction, and there's a 90% probability that it's this type of vessel. That you can downlink with less than a kilobyte, rather than having to downlink hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of gigabytes of raw imagery of a
correct me if I'm wrong. So essentially, you basically, instead of sending the raw data back to Earth, you do the compute in the space,
yes,
and then you send the only output this is required.
Yes. So we run the inference workload on that data, and the inference then produces some insight. And the insight, as I say, could be information about the.
So you mentioned Blue Origin among the companies. I was just wondering if this concept of space compute and clouds in space would be that attractive. What stops, say, Jeff Bezos from building AWS in space?
Not very much, to be honest. No, I mean, I don't want to speak too quickly for them, but we know they are very keenly looking at this space. So I'm not trying to encourage competitors.
Well, maybe it's not something bad because you can grow the market together, push the market in a way.
Yeah, I mean, you're right though. It's a very good point you raise. If what we're saying is correct, which is my personal opinion, is that within 10 years, almost all new data centers will be being built in space purely because of the constraints we have on energy terrestrially. So if that's correct, that statement, there's two data center companies that have a space arm. One is XAI with SpaceX, and the other is AWS with Project Kuiper. And so it would probably make sense that those will enter the space. The other data center companies right now do not have a space arm. Google doesn't, Meta doesn't, Microsoft doesn't, Oracle, OpenAI, etc. And so they would need to partner with somebody who has that capability. And at that point, we might become a viable partner for one of those guys.
The sort of current model, I mean, traditionally in sort of space, the compute is compromised the compute power is compromised by other characteristics like longevity of this hardware in space because of immense radiation. So you need to invest a lot in sort of hardening all the electronics to be able to survive for long missions of 15 years. And in this context of Starcloud, as I understand that you sort of betting on the latest chips from NVIDIA, which essentially would become out of sort of date or within 5 years of working in the space. So you kind of betting on replacing them sort of like a cartridge in a printer every 5 years. Is that correct?
Correct.
Could you tell us, I mean, how do you see how viable would be this model in the long term?
It's viable if the launch cost is low. Everything has a break-even point dependent on the launch cost. So the key unlock in all of this is really the launch cost falling very, very rapidly. I would say though that there's nothing different about what we're doing than how terrestrial data centers work. So some people misunderstand might be the right word, but some people don't see why if a chip is out of date in 18 months, that means we're going to have a problem with replacing it. And actually, we don't have a problem because it's the same in a terrestrial data center. If you have a chip the last 5 years, you put it in a data center, in 18 months, a new chip comes out. You don't turn that one off. You keep that one running because you've spent the capex on it already. And then you just use new chips. And it's exactly the same for us. So yes, there'll be new chips coming out in 18 months, but we're still going to be drawing value from those old chips. Maybe
let's touch a little bit on sort of a radiator in the room. In your white paper, it says that it will require a massive, sort of not massive, but rather huge scale of radiators to be able to cool down the chips. So basically, we're talking about 4 and 4 kilometers.
Yes, that's the solar panel, and then the radiator is 1 by 4 kilometers.
Yeah, which is in the current sort of industry sort of benchmarks would require you to basically invest a lot in building a new type of materials, more like lightweighted, and essentially become a sort of space radiate company. Yes.
Oh, do you mean Radiator or
no?
robotics?
But you need to construct construct this, right, somehow in space using robotics. So essentially, does it mean that you will become like a space sort of construction robotics company rather than the data center company?
It really depends how complex the deployment methodology for the radiator is. We're working on some very simple deployment mechanisms. I mean, for example, with the solar panels, one of the simplest mechanisms for deploying very large surface area solar panels is just to unroll them. And you don't need a huge amount of, so you can roll these very, very 30 micron thick solar panels in quite a tight package and then unroll them. We're working on very simple radiator design as well that will not require too much robotic assembly.
But it's still rather huge.
Still huge. Definitely huge.
Sort of objects. What's your vision? How do you see that making this a reality?
I mean, it's a great question. So half of our engineering team is working on radiator design and deployment. The other half of our engineering team is working on radiation hardening of the chips.
Are you still invest in hardening? Okay.
We're not making new chips, but we are working on ways to make the chips survive this space environment. So yeah, that's both on the hardware side, mainly hardening, and also mainly shielding, and also on the software side. So algorithms that produce redundancy. But yeah, so half the team is working on this radiator. We've got, the best space radiator engineers in the world. So we've got the guy from NASA, from Jet Propulsion Laboratories. That's the deep space arm of NASA that designed the radiators on the Europa Clipper mission. It's NASA's most expensive deep space probe. He also designed the radiators on a recent lunar lander and 3 of the NASA payloads on that. So I think he's one of maybe the best in the world in terms of designing space radiators. You can almost think of us as a space radiator company. That is the core technology that we're trying to solve for.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you also proposed this very smart sort of idea of placing this in a Terminator area. Could you explain a little bit more on that? How does it work?
Yeah. So for the viewers and listeners, most low Earth orbit, low altitude orbits you're half the time in the shadow of the Earth and half the time in the sun. So, for example, if this is the Earth and the sun is coming from here, if we're flying like this, then it means we're in the sun here and we're behind the Earth here. So that what that means is you'd need to have very expensive batteries so that you can continue. You charge the batteries when you're in the daylight, and then you dissipate all of that when you're behind the Earth. There is one very special orbit called a dawn-dusk sun synchronous orbit, where you fly around the Terminator line. And what that means is that you can then be 24/7 in the sun. There's a few nuances to that. One of which is that as the Earth moves around the sun, you don't want, if you're going like this, if it moves around here, you need to also change otherwise you're going to have the same problem. And so then that's where this sun synchronous element comes in. And if you fly at a 7-degree angle, basically off the Terminator line, or actually off the rotational axis, that gives you this 1/365th movement every day that you're orbiting. And so that means that in a whole year, you're always facing in the exact Terminator line.
Basically, it's designed in a way that the solar panel side always facing the sun, and the radiators will be facing sort of the shadow,
facing away from
the shadow from the panel, I guess, in a cooling.
Yes. Yeah.
Apart from trying to reduce the cost of shipping and solving the problem of building these radiators more feasible way, what are the major challenges in what you perceive in achieving what your vision is with Starcloud?
I would say those are definitely the two biggest challenges. One is the dissipation of the heat, and the second is the enabling these chips to work in a very harsh radiation environment in space. On the engineering side, that's definitely the two most difficult challenges. One of them, another challenge that we did have but we don't have now, was this whole thing is not possible unless we have the world's best space engineers on our team. So we took 18 months to make our first hire, and that was a good decision because we now are in a position that hire was extremely strong, and then from there, every hire we've had since has been keen to join the team, and it kind of snowballs. Good engineers want to work with other good engineers, and so having this base of talent means that people now want to join us, which is great.
And where are you now in terms of you're preparing for the first launch?
Yeah,
it will be a 60-kilogram satellite.
Yes, yeah, you're very well researched, by the way. I appreciate that. The first one is 60 kilogram small sat. It's about the size of a small fridge. So that's going to go up in August, and then we have our second satellite launching in October next year. That's about a 300.
And what do you plan to achieve with this launch?
The first one will have the first H100s, the first other types of NVIDIA chip. It's going to be about 100 times more powerful GPU compute than has ever been operated in space before. And that one will do lots of things for the first time. It will be the first to run a small training workload in space, the first training model, the first to do high-powered inference in space, the first to do fine-tuning of a model in space. We're going to do some fun stuff, like we'll be running a version of Gemini. So we're in the Google Cloud Accelerator program. And so because we also have an Iridium link, so a sort of real-time Iridium link. So we'll be able to have a Ask Me Anything on Reddit, and people can be like, we're going to plug the telemetry into this Gemini model, and then so it will be, you can say like, oh, like where are you now, and what does it feel like to be a satellite? And it'll be like, I'm just flying over Africa now. I'll be over in the Middle East in about 10 minutes, and it's kind of weird being a satellite. Like it will talk back to you as if it's.
You want to use that as an opportunity to demonstrate the ability to do the cloud, literally Starcloud sort of computing for the public, basically.
Yeah.
And what's your timeline as more like a commercial launch, where you see how long it will take you?
Yeah, so first commercial launch is in October next year. That's this much larger, close to 10 kilowatt, 300 kilogram satellite. That will offer cloud services for other satellites. We'll have extremely capable connectivity on that satellite as well. I won't exactly say what it is, but extremely orders of magnitude better connectivity than almost any other satellite currently. And that will enable us to provide a very useful service for other satellites. Then we'll launch, I think, the roadmap is essentially we would like to do a 4-ton 1 megawatt satellite in 2028, and then all the way up to a full Starship payload bay that's 100 tons, 40 megawatts in the early 2030s. That's where it really becomes cost competitive with terrestrial data centers. I would say if the Starship launch schedule looks like it's going to keep getting delayed, then we will just launch other iterations of this smaller Falcon 9 sized spacecraft in 2027 and 2028.
And primarily you focused on providing these chips for large language models training. Is that the primary?
The main use case is for inference rather than training. We're doing some training just to show we can, basically. But until we have very large clusters, the only training use case that's actually useful right now on a smaller cluster is doing fine tuning of a model. So that if we, for example, if you're trying to detect a type of threat terrestrially, then you can, if a new threat comes available, rather than having to send the whole model to the ground, retrain it with the new threat, you can do fine tuning of the model with the new threat on orbit, for example.
So inference is pretty much the main sort of functionality that you expect from the Starcloud.
Yes.
I mean, let me ask you a question that I guess you are probably asked many, many times. But I think it's important to highlight this. So what Starcloud proposes is a massive benefit to sort of Earth. That's what also I think Sam Altman spoke a few days back, that we inevitably have to move to space because the current sort of land data centers, the pollution becomes, and the amount of heat generated becomes massive. How do you see this will essentially solve this problem?
Actually, you're the first person that's ever asked me that. And I don't think anybody else, I've not come across either investor or basically anybody else except for, there's like 3 people I've ever heard talk about this problem. One is Sam Altman very recently. The other one is Jan Lek from, he was a researcher at OpenAI and now he's at Anthropic. He's a small seed investor in us. And the other one is a guy who wrote, I don't actually know his name, but I've seen a paper that he put out in about September last year.
Saying in a good company.
And just for the viewers, maybe I'll elaborate a touch on that point. Lots of people are very aware that, for example, burning lots of fossil fuels is a bad idea for the environment, and they think that the main constraint we're going to face is if you burn fossil fuels, that leads to global warming because of putting CO2 into the atmosphere, and that traps the heat more than it would otherwise. That is actually very small portion of the end state problem with building enormous amounts of data centers. There comes a point where if your total energy consumption goes up by, it could be 10x, it could be 100x, or it could be 1000x. I won't give the exact number, but there does come a point where even if all of your energy sources are renewable, let's say fusion works, even if let's say you're just using solar panels, for example, just from the heat that your chips are generating, and this is more for fusion than solar actually, because solar takes energy out, but just from that heat, you are significantly warming up the planet just purely by pumping heat from these data centers out into the atmosphere, not necessarily because of carbon dioxide, just because of heat. And yeah, if you believe it's on the order of 10 to 100x, that's probably within our lifetimes that becomes a big problem. And at some point, then the only way, if you want more compute, that you can have it is by figuring out a way to dissipate that heat in a vacuum into the infinity of deep space. So yeah, you can argue about where that number is, but it certainly happens at some point. And given the exponential we're now on, we should start thinking about it now. And the only solution is building enormous radiators in space, which is what we're doing.
Another proposal is to build it underneath the surf in the water.
That doesn't solve it because you're just warming up the oceans. Then we're really talking about enormous amounts of heat that you're pushing out, and warming up the oceans is just as bad as warming up the atmosphere at that point. Okay,
and if we say move a big portion of compute into the space, then there are also, I think, there's certain skepticism or criticism of potentially to have risk of sort of a Kessler syndrome, which basically a theory that at some point, due to certain collision in the space of objects, will be entrapped in the Earth, will not be able to travel to the space because of the polluted sky, basically. And do you see what do you tell to the critics of this approach, who might accuse Starcloud of bringing basically pollution from the earth to the sky?
The first time I heard about Kessler syndrome, I spent like a month thinking about it and being worried about it, because it seemed like a catastrophe, and it is a catastrophe, if it happens. So for the viewers, Kessler syndrome is where if you have one piece of space debris that collides into another, that creates 1 million fragments, and then each of those 1 million fragments can collide into other satellites, and then you just have this cascading effect where you just end up with this cloud of debris that you can't then penetrate through. It's much less likely than you think to occur. And one of the reasons is, particularly in low Earth orbit, and anything below about 400 kilometers is almost impossible to have Kessler effect, because everything is deorbiting naturally within about 2 months anyway. And so what happens, and if you have a debris cloud, by the time it gets around to another orbit, that whole debris cloud will be 50 to 100 meters lower, and then it will be 50 to 100 meters lower and 50 to 100 meters lower. And it just, you're very rapidly, the whole thing very rapidly deorbits anyway, basically. I'll give one example. People don't realize this, but in 1970, the US government released 400 million needles about this big into a 3,000 kilometer altitude orbit. And 3,000 kilometers people generally think is not, there's not much like upper atmosphere there to slow things down and deorbit it. But that was 1970. Not a single one of those needles is still in orbit. And the reason is because of this three-body system that we have, the moon, the sun, and the earth. Every so often they end up coming a little bit closer to Earth. And what that means is as soon as they start coming within a sort of 500 to 1,000 kilometer range, they will naturally start dragging themselves in and spiraling towards the Earth. So I think, for our first two satellites, we essentially want to avoid the congested parts of space. So for our first two satellites, we're flying in a very low, they call it VLEO, very low Earth orbit, so around 380 kilometers altitude for the first one at least. After we're of a certain size, we can start flying higher. And so we're targeting around 1,200 kilometer altitude for the later versions. That's the lowest you can fly where you're 24/7 in the sun with this dawn-dusk sun-synchronous orbit. It's a very unpopular orbit because you're flying then in the Van Allen radiation belt. And so we can only do it when we have a much larger satellite and when the shielding then becomes a lower portion of the mass. But essentially to avoid collisions, you want to avoid the congested parts of space. And then, Kessler syndrome it's not really possible in a very low Earth orbit, but it's something we need to watch out for in higher orbits.
Especially like you mentioned, your task was to build like a large, basically like 4 and 4 kilometer massive data center craft that's likely could meet some space rubbish that can collide with this is something that you envision might be a problem going forward?
There will certainly come a time when it's a problem. So we need to be aware of it. Yeah, I mean, Starlink right now has about 6,000 satellites. They all have pretty large solar panels and radiators. No, not radiators, just solar panels. As far as I'm aware, they haven't had a single collision. I mean, you get hit by micrometeorites all the time. So does the International Space Station. That's stuff that comes in from outside the solar system.
But the International Space Station is a dwarf compared to what you try.
It's not a dwarf. What we're doing is not.
Wise.
Yeah, but I mean, Starlink has 6,000 satellites. I mean, that's pretty massive. Like they're drawing significant power right now.
So, like you mentioned, one of the major use case is still for AI industry. Let it inference for compute. Now, essentially, what AI industry is focused, or at least some of the most known representatives, is to achieve the AGI at some point. And you see Sam Altman and Elon Musk talking about that constantly. But you kind of, I haven't seen any of opinions of you personally on that matter. Now, if that's the pursuit of AGI is going forward and you're sort of playing a role in this whole process, Do you see yourself more like a plumber who just builds pipes and let these companies decide? Or what's your personal philosophy on how the future might be? What's your personal vision when it comes to AGI?
It's a good question. Well, I'll touch on the plumber point and then I'll come back to AGI. Sometimes people ask me, because in Silicon Valley, there's this question, there's a point they often make where they say, in a gold rush, you should be selling picks and shovels, right? And they ask me, do I think I'm digging for gold or selling picks and shovels? And the fashionable answer is to say that you're selling picks and shovels. I actually like to think we're digging for gold, where the gold is the sunlight and we are harvesting that energy resource in space. Because at some point, you don't actually want to dig for gold. There are some times in the history where digging for gold is not the worst idea. I think what we're doing is one of those. But in terms of AGI, I'm of the opinion that we have essentially passed the singularity. I think we are now in runaway iteration and pretty close to self-iteration. And you wouldn't call it AGI just yet, but certainly within 24 months we'll be at AGI. And then,
and what does it mean for you, the AGI?
AGI means a point where it can replicate itself smarter than it is already. And once it can do that, then that thing can replicate itself smarter, and then that thing can replicate itself smarter. So basically, you could replace every AI researcher inside OpenAI with a agent or with an LLM or something. That's, to me, where we have AGI. I mean, already they're better than most, very smart PhD candidate would be. So, I think we're extremely close to AGI. And when we hit AGI, I think it'll be like when we did the Turing test. Like, people thought the moment you pass the Turing test, it's going to be a huge global news. And we just breezed through the Turing test. Nobody batted an eyelid. And I think it'll be the same with AGI. I think we're going to breeze through it in the next 18 to 24 months and nobody will care.
And what's your sort of envisioning? How do you envision the future with AGI and sort of your role in this whole process?
We are, we're an enabler of AGI. We're the infrastructure behind it, I guess. It would be right to be a little bit worried about the implications of AGI. There is definitely a world where you have extreme abundance, and that it is made possible by humanoid robots and in combination with very advanced AI. But there's also definitely a world where things get a bit scary. And so, we were talking earlier about the Fermi paradox, and it's something I spend a lot of time thinking about, which is the idea that there should be intelligence everywhere in the galaxy, and yet we don't see any. And it could be that there is any intelligent civilization hits a point where they self-destruct for some reason. And I think you can make a reasonable case that it could be the advent of AGI that causes that, and in which case we would need to be very careful about that.
So finally, where do you see Starcloud by 2040? How do you see the company? Where do you see yourself and overall sort of your envisioned timeline and plan for the company?
Yeah. So as I said, I think within 10 years, I think almost all new data centers will be being built in space because of this. And it won't just be us. I doubt it will just be us. I think we'll be deploying enormous amounts of compute to space by that point. It will take a little while to get to the point where more than 50% of total compute is orbital. In 10 years, I still think 99% or 95% of all compute will be terrestrial, just because you have this huge lagging stock of data centers that are being built right now terrestrially. And they're still going to be used in 20 years' time. So in 2040, it could be, though, that more than half of all data center capacity is orbital. I'm
pretty much finished with my questions, but if there's some aspect that we didn't touch, you think worth to focus on? If you feel like there's... At this point, I would usually come back to that point you raised about that Sam Altman said. Oh, yes. But since you already touched on it. All right. Okay. Then, we pretty much covered most of the stuff that I want to ask. Great. Thank you very much, Philip. Thank you very much for having me.